Okay, so coming back to this, as I mentioned just before the break, two wars to follow up after 9/11, both failures in their own way. But I guess you could say the connecting link between the failures of these wars is that Afghanistan and Iraq are not al-Qaeda. Neither of them were actually the enemy that America was fighting against, but nonetheless stood in for the enemy. First, Iraq, misrepresentation and consensus views. As I say there, immediately after the attacks, the U.S. began planning a war against Afghanistan. Why Afghanistan? Well, because that was where al-Qaeda was based at the time. It's where Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda, was based. And it seemed to be a small step to conflate the ruling government of Afghanistan, the Taliban, with al-Qaeda, though in reality they were different entities. Important point there, this was something that Bush said after 9/11, that America would make no real distinction between terrorists who attack the United States and those regimes that harbor terrorists. So basically, it was saying that the Taliban and al-Qaeda existed on roughly the same level, and that immediately put the Taliban in the sights of the American government. But the Taliban was, as I say there, its own entity. Actually, in many respects, a kind of a product of America, because the Taliban were a group that battled against the Soviet Union during a previous war in Afghanistan, which took place during the 1980s, mainly because the Taliban opposed the communist ideology. But also the Taliban that had come to power in Afghanistan was this kind of rigidly ideological government that was not interested in fighting wars on the international stage. I mean, no, the Taliban was this kind of ragtag group of people that enforced very strict social mores, and indeed the mainstream media seized in particular on their misogynistic treatment of women, their brutal treatment of women as being part of the justification for the attack. The Taliban really seemed to be this kind of inward-looking regime that just wanted the international community to forget about them and leave them alone, whereas al-Qaeda was actually hell-bent on launching attacks against the United States. So they were indeed separate entities from the start. You see a map from the 1980s showing a distribution of different ethnic groups in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. Almost all members of the Taliban were Pashtuns, a specific ethnic group occupying large sections of Afghanistan and also part of Pakistan. The basic implications of this detail were lost in the rush to war in 2001. There you see the green section basically represents this particular ethnic group, which had maintained their own autonomy and independence during the course of the Soviet invasion, also during the course of a subsequent civil war, and had their own strict interpretations of Islam and was closely caught up with the Taliban. But one thing to note there is that this particular ethnic group did not occupy all of Afghanistan. In fact, that's part of the story here, is that the Taliban did not have complete control over Afghanistan. They only ever controlled something like 80% of the total territory in that country. And that goes a long way towards explaining what Osama bin Laden was doing in Afghanistan in the first place. It wasn't necessarily that he had this very close affinity with the ruling Taliban government, although he tried to make it sound like he did. No, it was the weakness of the Taliban regime. That's the main reason why he's there, because he wants to be in a place where you don't have a lot of state surveillance and where you don't have government officials everywhere and a lot of developed infrastructure. He just wants to be in a place where the ruling government leaves him alone, is unable really to deal with him, as was the case with the Taliban. I mean, the Taliban, in theory, could have rooted out Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda, but it wasn't even clear if they could do that. I mean, so this is the kind of idea here of America going to war to topple the Taliban regime, which is harboring Osama bin Laden, which without grasping why Osama bin Laden is there in the first place, precisely because the Taliban doesn't really control all of Afghanistan, only has a tenuous grip. And also note the ethnic group, the Pashtuns, spilling over into Pakistan as well, which would become very crucial subsequently. Pakistan certainly have been involved in, quote, harboring harboring terrorists. So was America going to go to war with Pakistan as well? Were they going to treat Pakistan on the same level? Well, no, of course not. Pakistan has an advanced military and a nuclear weapons program. Right? America's not going to war with them. So there was a little bit of the blurring of distinction. Yes, but Al-Qaeda can operate in Afghanistan and Pakistan. They can cross the border. So this idea of trying to isolate a particular country, this particular evil regime that we can take out, which will deal with the 9/11 attack, it misrepresents the reality of the situation, which is that this terrorist group was kind of malleable and flexible across the borders of nation states to begin with. In the autumn of 2001, a U.S.-led coalition dropped approximately 12,000 bombs on Afghanistan, resulting in the deaths of thousands of people, including civilians. Just as civilians were killed in the 9/11 terrorist attacks, civilians were killed in Afghanistan with the American coalition war that was launched in Afghanistan. The war received almost 90% support among Americans polled. It's very rare to see that level of consensus support among a population of people. This, I think, was in many respects a knee-jerk instinctive reaction. The need to strike out at somebody, at anybody, the kind of outrage that's fostered in that situation, the need to identify the enemy, and whoever that enemy is, that's the people we have to focus on. But support in the international community as well. Certainly support for the war was not as high when you start talking about other countries outside of America, but the international community, both NATO and the United Nations, supported this war as well. And I think that there is something very telling about that. You'd almost think this idea of when we have this consensus of view, when we have this kind of overwhelming majority supporting this decision or policy, that it would somehow be the correct decision, but I don't think that's always the case. In fact, I think it's often the case that when you have wide consensus support, that's often when the dumbest decisions get made, because there's this kind of rush to an instinctive, emotive consensus view. It wasn't that the war against Afghanistan was wrong because the Taliban was not a brutal, misogynistic regime. It certainly was. But the long-term plan with the war, that was what was idiotic. Because there was this question of what comes after the Taliban in Afghanistan. The other side to that, by December of 2001, the Taliban had been toppled, so this was not a long war. It was met with this kind of jubilation and triumph, but again, it was the weakness of the Taliban regime. I mean, they didn't have air forces, they didn't have air force defenses in the country at the time. This was, in many respects, a kind of disjointed regime, and thus easy to oust from power, but what exactly is going to follow? There hasn't really been much in the way of building up institutional and infrastructural development in Afghanistan. Nothing in the way of kind of a solid government foundation. No, the country's been at war basically for 30 years by this point. There was a Soviet war, there's a civil war in the country, and there is one thing that holds true in most situations is it's very difficult to develop institutions and infrastructure when a country's at war or when it's under military occupation. War prevents that from happening. So America, or the international community, was going to have to get involved in a very long nation-building project if they wanted to maintain anything regarding security in Afghanistan. They were going to have to build an entire government apparatus in that country. They were going to have to engage in extensive training of local people, just reaching local people on a simple level. And was America prepared to do that? Absolutely not. They had no intention of doing that. This was just kicking the regime out of power, leaving this giant power vacuum, and then dealing with repeated insurgencies and attacks for the next 20 years because they'd not really defeated the Taliban. The Taliban had simply left the centers of power. That's all that had really happened. And all other nation-building enterprises were completely half-baked. There was never any traction or momentum. And thus this war, drags on for 20 years. Yes, 20 years, all the way up until 2021, to the point where America basically announces that it is withdrawing all soldiers from Afghanistan. And then within several months of this withdrawal, the Taliban retakes control of the country. So 20 years, you'd almost think, well, it wasn't the same fighters as before. Yes, but the ideas, the principles, the basic long-standing views, all of those things had continued, still existed across basically a generation. And also the fact that the Afghan interim government, such as it was, fell so quickly proved that it had never been built up in any substantial way whatsoever. Basically been a situation of civil war that persisted for 2 decades, and then this completely disastrous, chaotic withdrawal from the country, captured on live television, reported on media, with, in the end, all of these rescue flights leaving the main airport because there are a whole bunch of people in Afghanistan who have been left at risk from the Taliban regime. Not to speak of course, women in Afghanistan who are now at risk in a very broad sense for the Taliban regime. So this war lasted 20 years. I mean, if you can look at it in terms of what it accomplished for the United States or what it accomplished for Afghanistan, nothing, zero. Pointless, meaningless war. And how many people killed, how much devastation and carnage to accomplish nothing, basically zero over this period. And then Iraq. Now you see U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell delivering a presentation at the UN in 2003, arguing that Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction. He's holding a vial of anthrax, I think that's supposed to be, to talk about the dangers of chemical warfare. This was a narrative that emerged in 2002 and 2003. But as I said before, America had been planning the war against Iraq since basically 9/11, and maybe even before then, because the election of George W. Bush had certainly brought in more of a kind of hawkish contingent into the American government, which had a deep-seated distrust of Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq. Colin Powell's presentation to the UN was bunk. Iraq was not developing weapons of mass destruction. They probably would have wanted to, due to the kind of lesson of, well, developing the nuclear weapons game changer, as North Korea had been doing. But Iraq did not have the resources or the ability to develop these weapons at the time. They might have even wanted to create the impression they were doing that, hence the reason that intelligence services might have come to that conclusion. But in reality, the American government didn't really believe that they currently had these weapons available. This and other false claims, such as the idea that Saddam Hussein's regime had direct ties to al-Qaeda, for instance, never did, completely false, provide a justification for the war, which faced mass opposition around the world. There was not a consensus view this time. Opinion in America was fairly well divided at this time, but in other countries, there were massive protests. In some cases, if you add it up globally, millions of people taking to the streets, protesting in opposition, to the point where America was unable to secure the support of some of its key allies in Europe. Or Canada, for instance, did not participate in the war. This ended up being much more of a kind of a single state enterprise with the United States, or dual state, because the United Kingdom was involved as well, America and Britain together, plus a bunch of countries that the Americans basically paid off in order to lend their support to this war. Rationale, justification for the war, well, here was the bunk. Rationalization, never true. Here was a kind of other explanation that circulated prominently in the media. Iraq's vast oil reserves presented another, quote, hidden justification for the war, though the U.S. strategy was never as simple as merely plundering the country's resources. I don't know if even hidden is the right word. This was kind of an open secret at the time. You know, this idea, well, isn't America going to war for the purposes of securing Iraq's petroleum resources, which made it a much different situation than Afghanistan? They did not care about Afghanistan in terms of developing the country. Why? Because, well, they don't have anything like a huge amount of petroleum. Iraq, on the other hand, is certainly worth developing because they are sitting on top of all of this black gold, which is really worth something. I think Iraq's oil reserves are something like the 5th largest in the world or something like that. So yes, the potential is certainly there. And this was the criticism at the time. Well, isn't America basically going for the purposes of just securing, plundering these petroleum reserves? Yes, in part. It never was quite as simple as just taking the oil. I mean, that was the kind of idea that existed at the time, that this was going to be a kind of imperialist war where America goes there and just takes over the oil fields and then just, exports it back to the United States. Well, that wasn't really what they were going to do. The idea was to secure the oil fields, to get them out of the hands of Saddam Hussein, to prevent sort of oil shocks, which are problems that happen in the economy with petroleum, which we won't get into, but it's kind of like the energy crisis that happened in the early 1970s, the risk involved there, but also perhaps to develop a kind of long-standing relationship with a new Iraqi regime, which would be sort of similar to the relationship America has with Saudi Arabia. America became an ally of Saudi Arabia, even though when you speak about ideology and culture, the countries don't have a whole lot in common. Why? Well, because of Saudi Arabia's vast petroleum reserves. It was worth America's time to cultivate that relationship, to at least have that kind of ally on board. And that was probably their vision for Iraq in the long term. But another thing to keep in mind here is when it comes to just taking over the oil or using the oil as a justification. The oil was undeveloped at the time, and it takes a long time to even set up the infrastructure and manufacturing base. We have to keep in mind that as long as crude oil and petroleum just sits in the ground, it's not worth anything. In those circumstances, you need the whole industry built around it in order to actually make it valuable, because otherwise it's just nothing. It's kind of like saying, we have this giant forest in front of us, and this is basically the equivalent of having a beautiful large city built out of wood. Well, no, it's still just a forest as it is right now. It's not the equivalent. You'd have to tear all the trees down and develop it into the city. The same with crude oil. If it just sits in the ground, it's nothing until it actually gets developed. And that was going to take a very long time. And it wasn't going to happen as long as there was a war raging in the country. So what was the justification for the war? Yes, there was that kind of economic justification, rationalization based on petroleum. But as I say, it wasn't really the entire reason, because it didn't make sense to base an entire war on securing petroleum, which would not even yield anything for many years to come. In fact, Iraq's oil reserves are still to this day underdeveloped because the country's been at war for so long. So the other reason has to do with a kind of mentality that existed in America. Bush included Hussein's regime in a so-called axis of evil, as he said in one of his speeches, alongside Iran and North Korea. There you see some of the members of the axis of evil there. You have Saddam Hussein, you have Kim Jong-il of North Korea, Ahmadinejad of Iran. I guess that's Castro of Cuba there as well. The original axis only consisted of 3 regimes in the official speech. I say there, this perspective was stuck in a worldview that 9/11 had already helped to destroy. I think the kind of mentality here is that we have a certain number of threatening rogue regimes around the world, that the rest of the world is kind of moving in the direction of democracy and freedom, but there's just these outliers, these kinds of threats to the modern global order. We should take them out, because they're the ones who are ruining it for everyone else. They're the ones who are spoiling the kind of progress towards freedom. I think that was the basic mentality. They start with Saddam Hussein's regime in part because they regard his regime as the biggest threat, and also because Iraq is more economically viable due to the petroleum reserves. But 9/11 had already helped destroy this whole narrative to begin with. It wasn't just the case that the world is, generally speaking, harmonious and you just have a couple of rogue states. No, there was already this increasing level of fragmentation developing, which would only continue in subsequent years. But in the year 2003, you think about it, Russia, for instance, had endured years of economic crisis, was not regarded as a strong nation state. It's only under Vladimir Putin's extended rule that Russia reemerges as a threat. China was not quite the same superpower state that it has become today. Those are the kinds of seismic shifts that were going to happen in international politics. And this whole kind of rogue regime thesis totally ignores that, sees it from a different angle. You see Bush giving a speech on an aircraft carrier in May of 2003. The U.S.-led invasion of Iraq toppled Hussein's regime in just over a month. So this was another kind of high-speed war brought ostensibly to a conclusion. And he posed very kind of infamously in front of this banner with the words "Mission Accomplished" emblazoned across it, which of course would come back to haunt him later on because the mission had not been accomplished, at least not as far as the American pundits would claim, because there followed 8 years of a civil war in Iraq with hundreds of thousands of deaths. So it wasn't as though the war came to an end with the disintegration of Saddam Hussein's regime. Problems that developed in Iraq subsequently, exacerbated precisely by the invasion. The American invaders dismantled most of the secular institutions that existed at the time. This included the military, the political party, and the civil service. And they also expelled the Sunnis from positions of power. That was a minority group in the country that Saddam Hussein basically parachuted into the upper echelons of society in favor of the majority Shias. But all this really did is exacerbate a whole series of sectarian tensions, religious tensions that already existed in Iraq. The thing was, the secular institutions that had kind of kept Iraq together, had kept this hodgepodge of people together. As soon as you take those away, you're left with nothing but these sectarian divisions between people. And thus you have a whole lot of fighting between them, but also a diverse array of resistance to the American occupation. When the U.S. government would speak about fighting against the Iraqi forces, they weren't just talking about fighting against loyalists to Saddam Hussein, such that existed. No, these were people from all different spectrums of Iraqi society. You had people who belonged to the Sunnis, to the Shias, to the other different religious groups that existed in Iraq with different ideas and principles, all who hated the American occupation for their own reasons. So it became this kind of fragmented hodgepodge of resistance to America, as well as fighting amongst each other. As I say, a civil war situation that existed in the country for 8 years. And didn't even really come to an end at that point, because one of the biggest stories subsequently in Iraq was the rise of the Islamic State, or ISIS, as it's been known. You see a map published by the New York Times in 2015 showing territory controlled by the Islamic State, which was a very significant chunk of land at one point. I think I read that it was the size of Britain in terms of total territory and encompassing millions of people as well. Here you had a kind of an organization or a quasi-nation state, difficult to know how to characterize them, which was a self-styled descendant of Al-Qaeda. So yes, that would be the group that launched 9/11 in the first place. Well, here you have the Islamic State, which pledged an affinity, if not an allegiance, to Al-Qaeda. They were different from Al-Qaeda, though, in the sense that they actually conquered territory, actually took over territory. Al-Qaeda was just operating in different pockets here and there, whereas the Islamic State really tried to turn itself into a nation state, and as you can see, expanded not just in Iraq, but also into Syria with the Syrian civil war as well. So how do you like this as a kind of a product of the war in Iraq? America invades Iraq, the civil war follows. A group that pledges an affinity or connection to al-Qaeda emerges within Iraq as a response to the war. And not only emerges, but kind of swells into this nation state, occupying a huge amount of territory. It's almost as though America simultaneously creates the Islamic State, but also kind of roots it out at the same time. Kind of sounds a lot like the Taliban in the first place. So a product of the American invasion and occupation, but also this kind of idea of identifying the borders of the enemy, seeing the enemy as circumscribed in a particular plot of land instead of just existing flexibly across the country. Long term, what happened in the long term? Well, as of today, there are still thousands of American troops stationed in Iraq. The Islamic State has been defeated as of 2017, with their territory being taken back over. But again, the ideologies, the ideas are still very much present there in Iraq and Syria. And certainly when you look at Iraq today, insurgency, violence, protests, and political crises are still ongoing in that country. 20 years after the fact, the war, in many respects, is still ongoing in Iraq right now. As per bin Laden, the architect of the terrorist attacks, the individual who stood at the center of this, what happened to him? Well, he escaped from Afghanistan and resettled in Pakistan. By most accounts, he was almost killed during the original war in Afghanistan, and then intelligence is a little bit hazy on what exactly transpired, what led him to resettle in Pakistan. But as I showed you previously, he did have these support networks that crossed borders, so it wasn't as though taking out the Taliban was going to necessarily destroy al-Qaeda. He relied on a network of contact and support, though it is unlikely he ever received direct support from the Pakistani government. That's one of the accusations that has floated around America. The Pakistani government was supporting al-Qaeda. But keep in mind that bin Laden had a massive bounty on his head. I think it was something like $25 million that America was basically offering. So I think that if word had got out far within, say, the Pakistani government, that you could get $25 million if you found this person and turned him over to the U.S. government, well, I think that, the wheels would have turned a little bit quicker. It was probably a secret, his location, from everyone except his closest cohorts and advisors. America did find him in Abbottabad in Pakistan. There you see his compound, or his home, which I believe has since been torn down. And he was killed by U.S. Navy SEALs on May 2nd, 2011. There was a big lead up to the plan of attack here. Americans considered dropping a tactical missile on the home, but instead decided to engage in a direct kind of invasion without the knowledge or consent of the Pakistani government. Incidentally, it's a little bit hazy as to how the CIA was finally able to locate him, because by all accounts, Osama bin Laden was a very precautious, necessarily paranoid, you might say. Someone who very rarely left this compound, who had these big privacy walls built, who apparently wore a cowboy hat whenever he walked outside, so drones would not be able to identify him from above. He urged his various cronies that they should only travel on cloudy days because he was worried about satellite imagery, and he wanted them to grow very large trees around to provide camouflage. He was worried about people inserting microchips into his children, all sorts of different kind of ways he had of a tactical avoidance. So you could say he was someone who took every precaution and didn't necessarily continue the fight against America so much as he just holed up and hid for basically 10 years. The CIA probably tracked him through a courier. I mean, that's the typical explanation. He would have to stay in contact with people who would move from the compound to other places. So the American intelligence agency might have got wind of who one of those couriers was through interrogation and followed the person back to the compound. And a raid, bin Laden killed in this raid by U.S. Navy SEALs. There was some kind of piffle at the time that they would have been willing to capture him alive. Unlikely. They went there to shoot him and kill him, which is what happened, and that was the end of his legacy, at least for now. And finally, Obama. This takes us towards the latter part of the 2000s. A couple topics to consider: the desire for change and grassroots movements. You see the numbers for the 2008 election after George W. Bush had served 2 terms as the American president. And I say there, given the trends in U.S. politics, the 2008 election was unusually one-sided. In fact, remarkably one-sided. And I say the trends in American politics because clearly what had been happening was this increasingly ossified, rigid division between Republicans and Democrats. You only have to look at the 2000 election between Al Gore and George W. Bush, which apparently came down to a couple of hundred votes in the state of Florida. I mean, that's how kind of razor thin the margin had become. That was a trend in American elections as a whole, this kind of 50-50 split, polarization between the two sides, this us versus them mentality, left versus right. And when you have the kind of electoral college you have, then it comes down to not just a couple of states, but indeed a couple of counties. That had been the case in 2000 with Gore and Bush, and again, really in 2004 with George W. Bush and John Kerry. So what could change things to the point where you have, well, what accounts for a landslide in contemporary American politics? Well, really the drive for change. I mean, this was something that could not necessarily be repressed. And given the disasters of the 2 wars and also the 2008 financial crisis, this was really a kind of crisis era. And Obama became the face for change. He became this idea of a transition into a new version of American society and culture, and indeed he campaigned heavily on that idea of change. I mean, that was the word he used more than any other, and that certainly resonated across vast stretches of American society, the desire for a new direction. What happened? Well, he gets elected in 2008, and that was in many ways an expected result. Well, the early years of his administration, I mean, you'd have to call them troubled years, because on the one hand, what he inherited as president was a massive financial crisis, the 2008 crisis, which had basically threatened depression conditions in the United States. I mean, we're talking a massive housing market meltdown, the collapse of Lehman Brothers, a giant investment bank, and certainly other investment banks at serious risk at this time. There was indeed the possibility that America would sink into a situation like 1929. I mean, that was the risk facing the country. So for Obama, it was kind of like, welcome to office, right? Hope you have fun dealing with this giant mess. And he kind of had to burn through his political capital in the space of a year as he argued for costly and unpopular stimulus packages that basically rescued Wall Street on the assumption that this is the best way to go. I mean, that's basically what he was doing a lot of his first year in office, was developing these packages to rescue the American banking sector and the American automotive industry, both of which were in serious danger of completely tanking. And I say unpopular because, of course, when you're creating huge amounts of money, billions of dollars, and you're giving it to people who are already rich, it's the common person who's saying, where's my bailout package, right? Why is all this money going to rescue these sectors that have been around for decades while the average person is still suffering the fallout from the crisis? So this was an easy thing to criticize at the time. On the other hand, we can see the continuity between Bush and Obama that stretched between 2008 and 2009. This is part of the story of the early years of Obama as well, if not his administration in general. He campaigned on the promise of change, and he seemed to be a paragon, a kind of representation of change, but it wasn't really a big change when you got down to it. I mean, George W. Bush had already introduced precisely these kinds of stimulus packages. That was against the grain of the Republican Party. I mean, the Republicans had this stance of, well, just let the free market take its course. If banks are going to fail, then let them fail. Probably not the best strategy at the time, but that's the real kind of capitalist market competition thing to do. Bush was taking a different tactic. He was intervening in the market, using government intervention to kind of rescue the market at the time. Not only that, but Bush was probably doing that because he assumed Obama was going to win the election. I mean, that certainly seemed to be what was going to happen. Bush might have thrown his support behind John McCain, even though he and McCain and Bush were never really that close. But nonetheless, Bush probably thought, well, I think Obama's going to win. I better set things up for him down the line. So there was this kind of continuity from one regime to the next. And you could see that in other areas as well. The change, the transformation that is promised. Well, when you look at the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, do we really see that profound change? And even when Obama was attempting to tackle specific issues such as healthcare reform, that was something that was passed, but nonetheless became a major campaign point in 2016. Or how about gun control reform as well? Something that he was adamant about, and what traction, what momentum did that actually gain in America? There is little question that he'll mobilize a massive grassroots campaign. I mean, he was enormously popular, not among everybody, because no American candidate for high office is popular among everybody, but probably about as popular as you can get in the modern era on this idea of a kind of synergy or an energy, a kind of transition in American society. But what is perhaps noteworthy in retrospect is the way that that energy did not actually translate into lasting policy changes or structural transitions within America. It is really difficult when you just look at policy decisions on the big issues in America, the workings of the American political system, the economy, American foreign policy. It is really difficult to see what that giant transformation that everyone promised actually was. It was almost like there was this kind of rush of energy and enthusiasm, and then it just dies down after the election. It's all just kind of marshaled for the purposes of the election itself. What about other grassroots campaigns that emerged in America as well? There are certainly many of them. The Tea Party movement, which I mentioned previously, emerged around this time, opposing government waste and spending, but also the ridiculous birther movement as well, which actually became a thing in American culture, questioning whether Obama really was an American citizen, because apparently he could not or would not produce his real legitimate birth certificate, proving definitively that he was born on American soil, because that's what the law says for the presidency. This story gained momentum precisely because it was caught up with a bunch of assumptions, racist assumptions about Obama, that he had been born in Hawaii, which is kind of peripheral to America, and he was biracial, and he spent part of his youth in Indonesia instead of out in the American suburbs, and his middle name was Hussein. I mean, this is, the basic level of thought that's actually going into this, all feeding into this idea that, he's not really American. He's not really one of us. He's this kind of sinister, insidious person, this insider who is secretly bringing down the government from within. As I say, this idea actually gained momentum to the point where he was compelled to release his birth certificate. And you also have to appreciate the basic essentialist dimension of this thinking as well. Obama, when you look at his story, I mean, you could talk about, of course, his accomplishments as as a politician. But when you look at his story, he's had a very interesting trajectory across his life, which he spells out in his autobiographies. And there's an entire journey that an individual goes through to reach a particular point. But the other side to that is the idea that the individual's journey, as complex and multifaceted as it might be, is beside the point. No, what we need is the document, the essential document that tells us exactly who he is as a person. The birth certificate that tells us who he is at the moment he is born, because that's the most important thing about him clearly, not all the things he goes through over the course of his life. Famous moment at the 2011 White House Correspondents' Dinner, Obama roasted Trump over the birther conspiracy theory because Trump was one of the advocates of someone who promoted the idea that Obama should at least produce his birth certificate. So Obama made a bunch of jokes at his expense. In retrospect, this was probably a defining moment in Trump's decision to run for president. You wouldn't think so, except why expect the American politics to function on a higher level than this? President publicly makes fun of Trump at this dinner, and Trump said subsequently, Obama is the reason I decided to run for president, with the kind of implication of Obama's policies, Obama's, tax hikes. That's the reason. Well, I kind of suspect that it was actually this moment, Obama making fun of him, right? That's the reason why he decided to run for the presidency. So that's that for today. Yes, and we're out of time. So, as I say, I'm not sure if we'll come back for the on-site portion of the class. Maybe we will, but I'll let you know one way or the other. But in the meantime, enjoy the time off.